Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm fully aware that for a lot of you, my voice is the last thing you hear before you fall asleep. So, before you're out cold, I thought it would be cool if you left a comment telling me what part of the world you're in. And of course, if you like what we do here, please like and subscribe. Now, sit back, relax. Locals warned the new family about this farmhouse. The sprawling property located on County Road J, just outside of Beatrice, Nebraska, was built in 1920 by a wealthy grain merchant. Thomas Bennett was a 40-year-old software developer who purchased the farmhouse in March of 2021, looking for a quiet place to work remotely. He moved in with his wife Sarah, who was a 38-year-old freelance graphic designer, and their 7-year-old daughter named Emily. The family relocated from Chicago to escape the high cost of city living and to provide their daughter with more outdoor space. Property records from the Gage County Assessor Office indicate that the house had sat vacant for nearly 5 years before the Bennett family acquired the deed. The real estate agent reportedly disclosed that the previous owners had left abruptly, but provided no specific details regarding their departure. The family arrived on a crisp afternoon in April, eager to begin renovations on the historic two-story structure. The initial week in the farmhouse was occupied with unpacking boxes and setting up a modern security system to monitor the isolated perimeter. Thomas installed motion-activated cameras at the front gate and the rear entrance near the detached barn. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down the gravel road, which meant the family was completely isolated at night. Sarah noted in a personal blog she kept at the time that the silence of the countryside was heavier than she expected. She mentioned that the locals in town gave them strange looks when they mentioned which property they had bought. A cashier at the local hardware store allegedly told Thomas that the soil on that land was sour and nothing good would stay there. Thomas dismissed these comments as rural superstition and focused on repairing the wraparound porch. The first documented incident occurred on the evening of April 12, 2021, according to a digital log from the home security system. The family was eating dinner in the kitchen when they heard a loud, rhythmic banging coming from the floorboards beneath their feet. Thomas assumed it was the old plumbing settling or perhaps an animal trapped in the crawl space. He grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement door, which was located in the pantry. The door was secured with a heavy iron slide bolt that the previous owner had installed on the kitchen side. Thomas unlocked the bolt and descended the wooden stairs into the unfinished basement. He later told his brother that the air down there was 20 degrees colder than the rest of the house. Thomas inspected the pipes and the foundation walls, but found no sign of pests or loose brackets that could explain the noise. He returned upstairs and secured the bolt again, telling his wife that it was likely just the house settling. However, the banging returned 2 nights later at the exact same time of 1800 hours. This time, the sound was accompanied by the distinct smell of sulfur that permeated the kitchen and dining room. Sarah called a local plumber to inspect the gas lines the following morning, fearing a leak. The invoice from the plumbing company notes that the technician found no gas leaks and confirmed the system was pressure tight. The technician reportedly left quickly and refused to go back into the basement after hearing a sound he could not identify. The situation escalated on April 20th when the motion sensors on the back porch were triggered at 3 a.m. Thomas woke up and checked the live feed on his phone, expecting to see a coyote or a deer. The screen showed the back porch illuminated by the floodlight, but the area appeared to be completely empty. He watched the feed for several minutes until the light timed out and shut off, plunging the yard back into darkness. Seconds later, the sensor triggered again, and the light flooded the porch once more. This cycle repeated 5 times in rapid succession, which suggested something was moving just on the edge of the sensor range. Thomas retrieved a baseball bat and went to the back door to visually inspect the yard through the glass. He saw nothing outside, but noticed that the heavy wooden barn doors, which he had padlocked the day before, were standing wide open. The barn was located 50 yards from the main house and was used only for storage of gardening equipment. Thomas did not go out to the barn that night, but called the county sheriff to report a potential prowler. The dispatch log shows that a deputy arrived at 0345 to patrol the property. The deputy found the barn doors open as reported, and the padlock was lying on the ground intact and locked. This detail implied that someone had either picked the lock or the hasp had been unscrewed from the wood. The police report states that no footprints were found in the mud around the barn despite the recent rainfall. The family decided to install additional locks on all exterior doors and windows the following day. Sarah began to complain of headaches and a feeling of nausea whenever she spent time in the living room. She took Emily to a doctor in Lincoln to rule out carbon monoxide poisoning or mold exposure. Medical records indicate that both Sarah and Emily were in perfect health with no signs of environmental toxicity. Thomas, meanwhile, began to research the history of the property at the local library. He discovered archived newspaper clippings from 1955 detailing a domestic dispute at the farmhouse. The articles mentioned that the original owner had disappeared under suspicious circumstances and was never found. The local sheriff at the time had suspected foul play, but could never prove it due to a lack of physical evidence. On the night of May 5th, the family experienced an event that led them to contact the authorities again. They were all sleeping in the master bedroom on the second floor, having decided to co-sleep for safety. At 0200 hours, they were awakened by the sound of the piano in the downstairs parlor, playing a single discordant chord. The piano had been left by the previous owners and was wildly out of tune. Thomas instructed his wife to lock the bedroom door and call 911 while he grabbed his licensed firearm. He listened at the door and heard heavy footsteps slowly ascending the main staircase. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, causing the old wood to creak under considerable weight. The footsteps stopped directly outside the master bedroom door, and silence filled the hallway for several agonizing minutes. Sarah was on the line with the emergency dispatcher and was whispering that there was an intruder in the house. The recording of the 911 call captures the sound of the doorknob being jiggled violently from the outside. Thomas shouted that he was armed and would shoot if anyone entered the room. The jiggling stopped immediately and was followed by a sound that Thomas described as fingers scratching against the wood of the door. The scratching continued for 2 minutes until the sound of sirens became audible in the distance. When the scratching ceased, the family heard the footsteps retreat back down the stairs and the front door slam shut. Sheriff deputies arrived in force and surrounded the perimeter of the farmhouse before entering. They found the front door unlocked and standing slightly ajar, which contradicted Thomas's claim that he had deadbolted it. The officers swept the entire house and found no one inside. However, they did find deep scratch marks on the outside of the master bedroom door that had stripped away the paint. The piano in the parlor was closed and the dust cover was undisturbed, which puzzled the investigators. If someone had played a chord, they would have had to open the cover and then close it again perfectly. The deputies took photos of the damage to the door and filed a report for breaking and entering. Thomas showed the officers the footage from the internal security cameras he had installed in the hallway. The timestamp on the video matched the time of the incident perfectly. The footage showed the hallway was empty when the sounds of the footsteps were heard on the audio track. The door handle could be seen turning and rattling on its own without any visible hand manipulating it. The deputies were reportedly visibly disturbed by the video and requested a copy for evidence. The file was added to the county case database, but no explanation was ever officially offered. The official police statement suggested a technical malfunction or a prank, but did not elaborate on how the physical damage occurred. The Bennett family packed their essential belongings that same night and drove to a hotel in Lincoln. They refused to spend another night in the farmhouse and listed the property for sale 2 weeks later. During the moving process, Thomas hired a professional moving crew to retrieve their furniture so they would not have to enter the house. The movers reported no unusual activity during the day, but noted that the basement door was unlocked. Thomas was certain he had locked the slide bolt before leaving that night. The house sat on the market for 8 months before being sold to an investment firm at a significant loss. The property has remained vacant since the sale, and the investment firm has not announced any plans for development. A local historian later contacted Thomas and shared a piece of information that had been omitted from the official records. The grain merchant who built the house had a son who suffered from a condition that required him to use leg braces. The historian claimed that the rhythmic banging sound the family heard was consistent with the sound of heavy metal braces hitting the floor. This detail aligns with the heavy footsteps Thomas described hearing on the stairs. However, there is no death certificate for the son in the county archives, and his fate remains unknown. The lack of documentation adds another layer of ambiguity to the history of the location. The scratching sound on the door remains the most tangible piece of physical evidence from the case. Forensic analysis of the photos suggests the marks were made by a tool or a very hard object rather than fingernails. The depth of the gouges indicated a level of force that would be difficult for an average person to exert without leverage. Skeptics argue that the family may have staged the event to get out of a bad mortgage or to gain attention. Yet the financial records show that the Bennett family lost nearly $50,000 on the quick sale of the home. This financial hit suggests that their motivation for leaving was genuine fear rather than profit. Neighbors eventually admitted to a local reporter that they had seen lights flickering in the house during the time it was vacant. One neighbor claimed to have seen a figure standing in the window of the master bedroom looking out at the road. This sighting occurred 2 days after the Bennetts had permanently vacated the premises. The description of the figure was vague, but the witness insisted it was too tall to be a child. The sheriff office has no record of any squatters being removed from the property in the years since. The house continues to deteriorate, and the barn has since partially collapsed due to neglect. The security footage from the hallway was never released to the public, but rumors of its existence circulate in online forums. Thomas Bennett has declined all requests for interviews regarding the farmhouse and has asked for privacy for his daughter. He currently lives in a gated community in a different state and has no social media presence. The only public comment he made was a brief statement to the real estate board regarding the disclosure of defects. He stated that the house had structural sound issues that could not be repaired. The ambiguity of his statement leaves room for interpretation regarding what those sounds actually were. Investigators in Gage County still consider the breaking and entering case to be open but inactive. There were no fingerprints recovered from the doorknob or the front entrance. The DNA sweep of the house yielded only samples from the Bennett family and the movers. The complete lack of forensic evidence of an intruder contradicts the audio evidence of the footsteps and the physical damage to the door. This contradiction is typical of cases in this region where isolation and older structures create a perfect storm for unexplained phenomena. The truth of what happened on County Road J remains buried in the conflicting reports and the silence of the empty fields. The final voicemail she left remains a mystery. The dense coniferous forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state are known for their breathtaking beauty and their oppressive isolation during the winter months. Clara Mitchell was a 29-year-old freelance architect based in Seattle who specialized in designing sustainable off-grid housing. She had rented a remote cabin near the Hoh Rainforest for a 10-day solo retreat starting on November 10, 2023. Her objective was to finalize the blueprints for a major client without the distractions of the city and to hike the local trails for inspiration. Clara was an experienced outdoorswoman who had hiked portions of the Pacific Crest Trail and was known by her friends as cautious and highly prepared. Dispatch logs from the Jefferson County Sheriff Office confirmed that she arrived at the rental property on schedule and checked in with the property management company via a landline application. The cabin was located 5 miles down a private gravel road that was prone to washing out during heavy rains. The rental property was a 2-story A-frame structure built in the late 70s that sat on a bluff overlooking a dense valley of hemlock and cedar trees. It was equipped with a satellite internet connection and a backup generator, but cell service in the area was notoriously spotty. Clara established a routine during her first 4 days, which involved working on her laptop in the mornings and hiking in the afternoons before the sunset. She communicated daily with her younger brother David, who lived in Portland, ensuring him that she was safe and productive. David later provided investigators with screenshots of their text messages, which showed Clara in high spirits, sending photos of the foggy landscape. The weather reports for the region indicate that a severe storm front moved in on the evening of November 14th, bringing 60-mile-per-hour winds and torrential downpours. The last confirmed text message from Clara was sent at 1945 hours that night, stating that the power was flickering. The storm intensified throughout the night of the 14th and continued into the following morning, knocking out power lines and blocking several access roads with fallen timber. David attempted to call Clara on the morning of November 15th, but his calls went straight to voicemail, which he assumed was due to the weather. He was not immediately alarmed because Clara had warned him that the satellite connection might go down during the storm. However, his concern grew when 24 hours passed without any word from his sister. He contacted the property management firm on the afternoon of November 16th and asked them to perform a welfare check on the cabin. The management company stated that they could not send a caretaker out until the county road crews had cleared the debris from the main highway. State records show that the road was not deemed passable until the morning of November 17th. David received a voicemail from Clara's number at exactly 3:42 in the morning on November 17th while he was asleep. He did not see the notification until he woke up at 6 in the morning and saw the missed call on his screen. The voicemail was 45 seconds long, and the audio quality was heavily distorted by static and digital compression artifacts. David listened to the message and was immediately struck by the tone of Clara's voice, which sounded breathless and terrified. She was whispering urgently into the microphone, and the background noise suggested she was outside in the wind. The transcript of the voicemail, which was later analyzed by audio forensic experts, contains several disjointed phrases that have never been fully explained. Clara can be heard saying they are on the roof, followed by a sound that resembles metal dragging across wet pavement. The most disturbing part of the voicemail occurs at the 20-second mark, when Clara suddenly stops whispering and goes silent for 10 seconds. The silence is broken by a loud mechanical thrumming sound that vibrates the microphone diaphragm, causing the audio to clip. Clara then speaks her final words, which were transcribed as, "Don't let them inside," before the call abruptly disconnects. David called the Jefferson County Sheriff Office immediately after hearing the message and reported his sister as a missing person in distress. He forwarded the voicemail file to the dispatch center and drove 4 hours north to the peninsula to join the search. Deputies arrived at the cabin at 10:30 in the morning on November 17th, finding the gate to the private road open. The responding officers approached the cabin with caution and noted that Clara's Subaru Outback was parked in the driveway, covered in a layer of pine needles. The vehicle was locked, and her purse, along with her wallet and keys, were found on the passenger seat. This discovery immediately escalated the situation because it suggested that Clara had not left the property in her vehicle. The officers found the front door of the cabin locked and had to use a master key provided by the management company to gain entry. The interior of the cabin was dark and cold as the heating system had shut down when the propane tank ran empty. Investigators found a half-eaten meal of pasta on the dining table, which had begun to mold, indicating it had been sitting there for days. There were no signs of a struggle in the main living area, and Clara's laptop was open on the coffee table. A search of the upstairs sleeping loft revealed that the bed had been slept in, but the sheets were tangled as if someone had exited in a hurry. The window facing the rear of the property was unlatched and slightly open, allowing rain to soak the carpet near the sill. Deputies found a single muddy boot print on the floor directly beneath the window, but the tread did not match any of the footwear Clara owned. The print was photographed and measured, but it was too smeared to provide a definitive shoe size or brand. The investigators then swept the exterior of the cabin and found that the crawlspace access panel had been removed and was lying in the mud. A flashlight beam directed into the crawlspace revealed nothing but damp earth and insulation hanging from the floor joists. The timeline of the voicemail became the central focus of the investigation because it contradicted the physical evidence found at the scene. The medical examiner who later consulted on the case estimated that the pasta on the table had been cooked on the evening of November 14th. This suggested that whatever happened to Clara took place 3 days before the voicemail was sent to David. Technical analysis of the cell tower data revealed that Clara's phone had pinged a tower 12 miles away from the cabin at the time the call was made. This tower was located on the other side of a steep ridge that was inaccessible by vehicle. The triangulation data placed the phone deep within a ravine that was known for its treacherous terrain and lack of hiking trails. Search and rescue teams were deployed to the ravine coordinates on November 18th using cadaver dogs and drones equipped with thermal imaging cameras. The terrain was incredibly difficult to navigate due to the dense undergrowth and the slippery mud caused by the recent storm. The team searched for 3 days without finding any trace of Clara or her clothing. On the 4th day of the search, a volunteer found a shattered smartphone lying on a mossy rock near a creek bed. The phone was confirmed to be Clara's device, but it had been smashed with significant force. The battery had been ejected and was found 10 feet away, submerged in the water. The damage to the phone made it impossible to retrieve any local data, but the SIM card was intact. The recovery of the phone raised a baffling technical question for the investigators and the telecommunications experts. If the phone was smashed and the battery was ejected, it should have been impossible for it to make a call. However, the call log from the service provider clearly showed an outbound call to David's number at 3:42 in the morning on November 17th. Experts suggested that the phone might have been destroyed after the call was made, but the location of the debris field suggested it had been there for days. Another theory proposed was that the call data was delayed due to the network outage and the voicemail was actually recorded days earlier. However, the metadata on the voicemail file itself was timestamped to the 17th, which ruled out a network delay. The audio of the voicemail was sent to a private lab for enhancement to isolate the background noises. The lab report stated that the mechanical thrumming sound was consistent with a large industrial fan or a turbine engine. This finding was perplexing because there were no industrial facilities or wind turbines within a 50-mile radius of the cabin. The sound of metal dragging was analyzed and determined to be consistent with a heavy chain being pulled over stone. David became obsessed with the audio and claimed that he could hear a second voice in the background if he turned the volume up. He insisted that right before the call ended, a deep voice whispered the word "open," but the official police transcript lists this as inconclusive static. Detectives interviewed the maintenance worker who had serviced the cabin's generator 2 weeks prior to Clara's arrival. The man was a 50-year-old local resident with a history of minor theft charges. He provided an alibi, stating that he was at a bar in Port Angeles on the night of the 14th, and his presence was corroborated by credit card receipts. However, a witness who lived on the main road reported seeing a gray van matching the worker's vehicle turning onto the private road on November 16th. The maintenance worker denied returning to the property and claimed the witness was mistaken about the date. Police searched his vehicle and home, but found no physical evidence linking him to Clara's disappearance. The investigation stalled in early 2024 due to a lack of actionable leads and the deteriorating weather conditions in the mountains. The case was classified as a missing person with suspicious circumstances, but no homicide warrant was ever issued. The prevailing theory among law enforcement was that Clara had suffered a mental health crisis or a medical emergency that caused her to wander into the woods. They theorized that she might have survived in the ravine for several days before succumbing to hypothermia. This theory, however, failed to explain the muddy boot print in the loft or the impossible timing of the phone call. The family hired a private investigator to continue the search, but the trail had gone cold. Some locals in the area have long shared stories about the ridge where the phone was found, calling it a place where the sound carries in strange ways. There are archived reports from the 1990s of hikers hearing mechanical grinding noises in that specific valley. Geologists have surveyed the area and found no seismic activity or underground caverns that would account for such acoustic anomalies. The unexplained sounds on the voicemail have fueled internet speculation but provided no comfort to the family. David continues to listen to the voicemail, hoping to decipher a clue that everyone else has missed. He believes that Clara was running from someone or something that night, and that the phone was planted in the ravine to mislead the search parties. The cabin remains a rental property, but the management company has installed bars on the lower windows and upgraded the security system. Renters who have stayed there since the incident have reported no unusual activity other than the occasional power outage. The mystery of how a dead phone could make a call and who made the muddy boot print in the loft remains unsolved. The file on Clara Mitchell sits in a box in the county archives filled with conflicting data points and unanswered questions. The final voicemail she left stands as the only testament to her last moments in the dark, rainy woods. To this day, no remains have ever been found, and the forest has kept it secret. In this new story, he thought the scratching was rats. It wasn't. In late autumn of 2014, strange noise complaints emerged from a secluded property in northern Maine. 32-year-old Arthur Pendleton lived alone and worked as a structural engineer evaluating old timber cabins. He initially dismissed the faint scraping sounds behind his drywall as common field mice seeking a winter shelter. County dispatch logs from November reveal a sudden escalation in his distress calls regarding the bizarre nighttime noises. What began as a mundane pest issue quickly evolved into an unresolved missing persons case lacking any explanation. Arthur had relocated to the Aroostook County region to study the architectural decay of several abandoned logging structures. His rented property was a refurbished two-story farmhouse situated roughly 14 miles away from the nearest town. For the first 3 weeks, state records indicate he maintained regular daily email contact with his Boston firm. Archived notes from his professional journals mention the surprising structural integrity of the local buildings he carefully surveyed. The surrounding dense forest provided a quiet environment for his highly technical and incredibly focused architectural assessment work. The engineer spent his early days driving a heavily modified utility truck across miles of unpaved dirt roads. He carried specialized measuring equipment designed to test the load-bearing capacity of century-old rotting wooden beams. The isolated farmhouse he rented served as a temporary base of operations for his extensive 3-month project. He reportedly chose this specific location because it offered quick access to deep forest trails and historic sites. Nobody in the nearby town knew much about his background or his ultimate reasons for taking the assignment. During his second week in the remote farmhouse, Arthur began noting minor acoustic anomalies in his daily journals. He wrote about a persistent, low-frequency vibration that seemed to echo through the solid oak floorboards nightly. A county file from 2009 indicated the property sat on naturally shifting soil prone to settling. Arthur initially attributed these subtle sounds to thermal expansion within the old wooden framing as temperatures dropped rapidly. However, his professional expertise soon led him to question the unusual rhythm and distinct origin of the noises. The subtle vibrations eventually transitioned into distinct scratching sounds originating from inside the primary ground floor exterior walls. Some locals claimed the old farmhouse had a long history of attracting large raccoons during the colder months. Arthur visited a small local hardware store and purchased several heavy-duty animal traps and strong chemical repellents. He strategically placed the metal cages around the concrete foundation and along the edges of the dark crawl space. He fully expected to capture a wild animal within a few days and resolve the annoying nighttime disturbance. 4 days passed without any success, and the heavy metal animal traps remained completely empty and undisturbed outside. The scratching noises continued to grow louder and more aggressive during the darkest hours of the early morning. Arthur documented how the sounds would often stop abruptly whenever he turned on a lamp or moved around. This cautious behavior struck him as highly unusual for simple rodents or common wild animals seeking winter warmth. He began keeping a heavy steel flashlight near his bed to investigate the walls whenever the scratching started. By the end of the 3rd week, the situation took a distinctly unnerving turn inside the isolated home. Arthur realized the scratching sounds were no longer confined to a single spot near the old stone fireplace. The noises actively tracked his physical movements as he walked slowly across the long wooden bedroom floor at night. He tested this theory by pacing from the window to the door and listening to the corresponding movement. Investigators never confirmed if multiple animals were present, but Arthur firmly believed something was intentionally following his steps. His growing anxiety pushed him to conduct a thorough daylight inspection of the entire property exterior and foundation. He walked around the perimeter with a digital camera and documented several strange markings near the rear entrance. He found deep vertical gouges in the wooden siding located nearly 6 feet above the soft, damp ground. The freshly exposed wood indicated the severe damage had occurred sometime during the previous heavy rainstorm that week. He immediately recognized the alarming height and sheer force required to create such deep markings in solid timber. Arthur contacted the local sheriff department and requested an officer visit the property to document the disturbing vandalism. The responding deputy noted the severe anxiety in Arthur's voice and spent an hour examining the exterior damage. The officer suggested a large black bear standing on its hind legs might be responsible for the gouges. However, a detailed search of the surrounding soft mud revealed absolutely no animal tracks or displaced vegetation anywhere. Arthur politely dismissed the bear theory and pointed out the precise and almost calculated nature of the scratching. The following night, the scratching sounds migrated from the ground floor walls to the ceiling directly above him. Arthur described the noise in his audio logs as heavy objects dragging across the exposed second-floor joists. The farmhouse had a small, unfinished attic space accessible only through a narrow wooden panel in the hallway. He spent hours staring at the ceiling and tracking the slow, methodical movements shifting above his living room. He recorded over 40 minutes of audio, capturing the undeniable sound of heavy weight pressing on the drywall. His Boston contracting firm received a final email from Arthur on the morning of November 22nd. He requested an emergency leave of absence and attached several heavily distorted audio files of the ceiling noises. The firm manager tried calling his cell phone multiple times, but only received automated out-of-service messages. The cellular reception in the deep Aroostook County woods was notoriously unreliable during heavy autumn wind and rainstorms. Arthur was entirely cut off from the outside world while trapped inside the echoing walls of the farmhouse. The strange noises reached a terrifying peak later that evening when a violent thunderstorm hit the rural area. Arthur sat at his kitchen table and recorded a final entry in his personal digital audio journal device. He calmly explained that the scratching had evolved into frantic clawing directly above his primary first-floor bedroom. He noted the structural groaning of the ceiling panels indicated whatever was up there weighed over 200 pounds. He expressed a deep, rational fear that the drywall would eventually collapse under the immense shifting physical weight. Desperation finally forced Arthur to make a second emergency call to the county dispatch center at midnight. He spoke in a harsh whisper and explained that an unknown intruder was currently trapped inside his attic. The dispatcher logged the call and immediately categorized it as an active home invasion requiring an urgent response. Arthur stayed on the phone and provided a highly detailed description of the ongoing frantic clawing sounds above. He explicitly stated the noise did not sound like any animal he had ever encountered in the woods. The audio recording of the emergency call captures the exact moment Arthur made a terrible and fatal decision. He told the dispatcher he was tired of waiting and intended to look through the hallway access panel. The dispatcher repeatedly ordered him to stay inside a locked room and wait for the armed deputies to arrive. Arthur ignored the strict instructions and stated he was simply going to shine his heavy flashlight up there. The call captured the sound of a chair sliding across the floor before disconnecting abruptly into total silence. Multiple law enforcement vehicles arrived at the secluded farmhouse exactly 45 minutes after the dropped emergency call. The heavy rain had washed away any potential footprints on the long gravel driveway leading to the property. They found the front door standing wide open, swinging violently in the harsh wind of the passing storm. Arthur's modified utility truck was still parked outside, and his wallet and keys were sitting on the table. The interior of the house was completely dark, silent, and showed no obvious signs of a physical struggle. Deputies drew their weapons and conducted a slow, tactical sweep of the entire ground floor and exterior perimeter. They found the kitchen and bedroom completely undisturbed, with Arthur's computer still running a structural analysis software program. However, they soon discovered the wooden attic access panel in the central hallway had been pushed completely open. A heavy wooden dining chair was positioned directly underneath the dark rectangular hole leading into the ceiling space. The deputies gathered beneath the opening and called out for Arthur, but received absolutely no verbal response back. One officer climbed onto the chair and slowly raised his tactical flashlight into the pitch-black attic space. He immediately spotted Arthur's heavy steel flashlight slowly rolling across the exposed wooden floorboards near the ventilation shaft. The officer carefully pulled himself into the cramped space and began crawling across the thick pink fiberglass insulation. The air inside the attic was incredibly cold and smelled strongly of decaying damp wood and raw copper. He signaled for backup as he discovered highly disturbing physical evidence scattered around the central load-bearing beam. Records conflict regarding what exactly the investigating officers discovered near the main ventilation shaft at the far end. Some official police reports state the officers found an old, filthy sleeping bag and several empty food cans. This mundane evidence strongly suggested an unknown transient individual had been secretly living directly above Arthur's bedroom. The squatter theory perfectly explained the heavy footsteps, the moving sounds, and the missing food from the kitchen. However, other highly confidential sources from the investigation claimed the physical evidence was much more sinister and ambiguous. A secondary forensic report described finding human fingernails deeply embedded in the wooden beams near the ventilation grate. The report suggested someone had been frantically clawing at the floorboards from inside the attic for several days. This terrifying detail aligned perfectly with Arthur's detailed audio logs describing the desperate scratching sounds above his head. Investigators found long strands of unidentified dark hair snagged on the sharp, rusty nails protruding from the roof. Whatever had been hiding up there had seemingly vanished into the stormy night without leaving a clear trail. The state police immediately launched a massive search effort through the surrounding dense timberland the very next morning. They established a command center at the property and brought in heavily trained tracking dogs to scour the woods. The dogs reportedly lost the scent completely less than 100 yards away from the farmhouse back door. They also utilized thermal imaging helicopters to scan miles of dense forest canopy for any signs of body heat. Despite the massive allocation of resources and manpower, they found absolutely no trace of the missing structural engineer. The property remained heavily scrutinized by forensics teams for the next 14 days without yielding any definitive answers. The deep gouges on the exterior siding were re-examined and matched the exact width of a large human hand. The heavy scratching Arthur heard was undeniably a person physically tearing at the architecture of the isolated house. The identity of the potential squatter and their disturbing motive for tormenting the isolated man remains completely unknown. No fingerprints matching anyone in the National Criminal Database were ever recovered from the dusty attic floorboards. Arthur's abandoned audio journals were eventually transcribed and added to the massive unresolved missing persons case file. Audio experts analyzed the recordings of the ceiling noises, but could not identify any specific spoken words or breathing. The deep, rhythmic thumping captured on the digital device continues to baffle sound engineers and law enforcement officials today. Some analysts suggest the acoustics of the old house amplified the movements of a relatively small person hiding above. Others believe the terrifying recordings capture something much larger, moving with deliberate and malicious intent in the dark. The Boston contracting firm officially terminated Arthur's employment contract 3 months after his mysterious and sudden disappearance. His remaining family members traveled to Maine to collect his personal belongings and abandoned professional surveying equipment. They reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while standing inside the quiet and empty rural farmhouse property. The landlord eventually boarded up the windows and securely padlocked the doors, leaving the building to slowly decay. The property quickly earned a dark reputation among locals who actively avoid driving down that specific dirt road. Years passed, and the dense Maine forest slowly began to reclaim the forgotten farmhouse and the overgrown driveway. Hunters occasionally report hearing strange, rhythmic thumping noises echoing from the direction of the abandoned two-story structure. Some adventurous teenagers broke into the house in 2019, but fled after hearing heavy footsteps upstairs. Police responded to their trespassing call, but found the interior completely empty and the attic access panel sealed shut. The legend of the scratching in the walls continues to grow and terrify the small surrounding rural community. Today, the state records officially list Arthur Pendleton as an active missing person with 0 new leads generated. Investigators never confirmed if he panicked and fled into the freezing woods or was taken by the unknown intruder. The truth regarding what he actually saw when he shined his flashlight into that dark attic remains a mystery. The case serves as a chilling reminder of the deep isolation found in the remote corners of northern Maine. Whoever or whatever was hiding in the ceiling space that cold November night has never been identified or caught. This dashboard camera captured a figure miles from town. The desolate stretch of asphalt, known as United States Route 50, cuts through the heart of Nevada and has earned the moniker the loneliest road in America due to its vast, unpopulated distances. Arthur Reed was a 38-year-old heavy-haul transport specialist who had spent the last 15 years navigating the most remote highways in the western United States. Reed was employed by a logistics firm based in Salt Lake City that specialized in moving sensitive mining equipment to isolated extraction sites. He was known among his supervisors as a meticulous driver who strictly adhered to safety protocols and maintained his vehicle with obsessive care. On the night of August 12, 2023, Reed was tasked with transporting an oversized generator unit from a depot in Ely to a distribution center in Reno. The total weight of his rig exceeded 80,000 pounds, which required him to drive during off-peak hours to minimize traffic disruption. Dispatch logs from the trucking company confirm that Reed completed his pre-trip inspection at 2300 hours and departed the Ely yard shortly before midnight. The vehicle Reed was operating was a late-model Kenworth T680 equipped with a sophisticated telematics suite and a dual-lens dashboard camera system. The camera was designed to record high-definition video of the road ahead while simultaneously monitoring the driver for signs of fatigue or distraction. The system was hardwired into the truck's electronic control unit, which allowed it to tag video files with real-time data regarding speed and braking force. Reed merged onto Route 50 and set his cruise control to 55 miles per hour as he settled in for the long drive across the Great Basin Desert. The weather reports for that night indicated clear skies with unlimited visibility and an ambient temperature of 65 degrees. Reed later told investigators that the first 3 hours of the trip were completely uneventful, and he encountered fewer than 5 other vehicles during that time. He listened to satellite radio talk shows to stay alert as the endless line of reflector posts flashed by in the darkness. The incident occurred as Reed was approaching the Eureka County line near a geographic depression known as Antelope Valley at approximately 3:14 in the morning. The road in this section is characterized by long straightaways that can lull drivers into a state of highway hypnosis if they are not careful. However, the telemetry data from the truck's black box indicates that Reed was actively making micro adjustments to the steering wheel, which proves he was fully alert. The onboard radar system, which is designed to detect obstacles and automatically engage the brakes if a collision is imminent, suddenly issued a proximity warning. Reed stated that he heard the sharp, audible alarm from the dashboard a split second before his headlights illuminated a shape in the middle of the westbound lane. He instinctively slammed on the air brakes and disengaged the cruise control while gripping the steering wheel to maintain control of the massive load. The physics of stopping a fully loaded semi-truck on a 2-lane highway required Reed to manage the braking pressure carefully to avoid jackknifing the trailer. The tires screamed against the asphalt as the anti-lock braking system pulsed rapidly to prevent a skid. Reed reported seeing a figure standing directly on the double yellow line approximately 200 feet in front of his grill. The figure did not attempt to move or jump out of the way of the 40-ton vehicle hurtling toward it. Reed managed to steer the cab slightly onto the gravel shoulder to widen the gap between the truck and the obstacle. The truck came to a violent halt in a cloud of dust and burnt rubber, roughly 50 yards past the point where the figure had been standing. The cabin was silent except for the heavy breathing of the driver and the mechanical ticking of the cooling engine block. Reed sat frozen in the driver's seat for nearly a minute as he processed the near collision and waited for his heart rate to stabilize. He checked the side mirrors, expecting to see a confused pedestrian or a deer standing on the road behind the trailer. The view in the mirrors was pitch black, save for the red glow of the trailer clearance lights reflecting off the settling dust. Reed unbuckled his safety belt and retrieved a heavy-duty Maglite flashlight from the door storage compartment. He opened the cab door and stepped out onto the aluminum running board before jumping down to the gravel shoulder. The air outside was silent and smelled strongly of sagebrush and ozone from the braking friction. Reed swept the beam of his flashlight across the roadway and the surrounding desert scrub looking for the person he was sure he had almost killed. The driver conducted a thorough grid search of the immediate area for 20 minutes, walking back and forth along the asphalt and the dirt embankments. He looked for footprints in the soft sand on the shoulder that would indicate where the person had entered or exited the highway. According to Reed's statement to the police, there were no footprints anywhere near the site except for his own boot marks. The asphalt itself showed the heavy black skid marks from his tires, but there was no physical evidence of a pedestrian. Confused and unsettled, Reed returned to the cab and locked the doors before calling the authorities via his satellite phone. He reported a potential hazard on the roadway and requested a patrol unit to verify the area was safe. While he waited, he decided to access the onboard computer to review the footage. The dashboard camera system had a small display screen mounted on the windshield that allowed drivers to play back recent events. Reed navigated the menu to the timestamp of the hard braking event and pressed play on the video file. The footage was crisp and clear, showing the high beams cutting through the darkness of the desert night. At exactly 03:14 and 12 seconds, a pale shape appeared on the center line at the edge of the light's reach. Reed paused the video and used the digital zoom function to get a closer look at the anomaly. The figure appeared to be a human male of average height, wearing a gray suit that looked tailored in a style from the mid-20th century. The man was standing with his arms at his sides, and his head turned slightly to the north, away from the oncoming truck. A Nevada Highway Patrol trooper arrived at the scene 45 minutes later, after being dispatched from the nearest substation in Austin. The trooper parked his cruiser behind Reed's truck and activated his emergency lights to warn any approaching traffic. He approached the cab and interviewed Reed, who was still visibly shaken by the experience. The officer recorded Reed's statement and then conducted his own inspection of the roadway using a high-powered spotlight. The trooper also utilized a handheld thermal imaging camera to scan the surrounding desert for heat signatures. The thermal display showed the residual heat from the truck's tires and engine, but the desert itself was a uniform cool blue. There were no warm shapes, indicating a person hiding in the brush or walking away from the highway. Reed invited the trooper into the cab to view the dashboard camera footage to prove that he had not been hallucinating. The officer watched the video several times and agreed that there was undeniably a person standing in the lane. However, the trooper noticed a disturbing detail that Reed had missed during his initial panic. As the truck approached the figure, the bright LED headlights should have cast a long shadow behind the man stretching out into the darkness. The video showed that the figure cast absolutely no shadow on the asphalt despite being fully illuminated. The light seemed to pass through the space where the shadow should have been, or the figure simply did not interact with the light in a physical way. The officer noted this discrepancy in his field report, but could offer no logical explanation. The trooper cleared Reed to continue his journey after documenting the incident as a collision avoidance with an unknown object. Reed drove the remaining distance to Reno in a state of high anxiety, constantly scanning the road for the gray-suited man. He arrived at the distribution center shortly after sunrise and immediately reported the incident to his company's safety department. The safety manager downloaded the full-resolution video file from the truck's hard drive along with the telemetry data logs. The company launched an internal investigation to determine if the braking maneuver was justified or if it was the result of driver error. Corporate policy required a detailed analysis of any event that triggered the collision mitigation system to prevent insurance liability. The technical team at the logistics firm analyzed the footage frame by frame using professional video editing software. They concluded that the figure on the screen was likely a digital artifact or a compression error caused by the camera's image sensor. They argued that the lack of a shadow was definitive proof that the object was not physically real. The report suggested that a momentary glitch in the sensor array had created a cluster of pixels that resembled a human shape. They pointed out that the camera had been running for hours in a low-light environment, which can sometimes cause sensor noise. However, the maintenance records for the truck showed that the camera system had been installed brand new only 2 months prior to the trip. Furthermore, the radar data contradicted the glitch theory entirely. The collision mitigation system on the Kenworth truck used a millimeter-wave radar sensor mounted in the front bumper to detect physical objects. The telemetry logs revealed that the radar had locked onto a solid target at a distance of 300 feet. The system had calculated the time to impact and had initiated the braking sequence independently of the driver's reaction. This meant that the truck's computer had detected a physical mass on the road at the exact same location where the camera saw the figure. It is extremely rare for 2 independent sensor systems to malfunction simultaneously in a way that perfectly corroborates a false positive. The conflict between the visual evidence of a shadowless figure and the radar evidence of a solid object baffled the company engineers. Some locals in the historic mining towns along Route 50 have passed down stories of strange occurrences on that highway for decades. Archives from the Eureka Sentinel newspaper in the 1950s contain a brief article about a traveling salesman who vanished on that same stretch of road. The salesman was reportedly last seen wearing a gray business suit and driving a sedan that broke down near Antelope Valley. His car was found abandoned on the roadside with the keys in the ignition, but the man was never seen again. Investigators at the time found no evidence of foul play, and the case eventually went cold. While there is no direct link between the cold case and Reed's video, the description of the clothing bears a striking resemblance to the figure on the tape. The ambiguity of the dashboard camera footage led to intense debate within the online community of professional drivers. Reed shared a clip of the video on a private industry forum in an attempt to find answers or validation. Many veteran truckers commented that they had seen similar inexplicable things on Route 50 but had always dismissed them as fatigue. One user, who claimed to be a former optical engineer, offered a detailed critique of the glitch theory. He explained that a sensor glitch would typically appear as a geometric block of color or a streak rather than a detailed human silhouette. He also noted that the figure's perspective changed correctly as the truck moved closer, which suggests it was a 3-dimensional object in the environment. The video was eventually leaked to a freelance investigative journalist who specialized in analyzing digital evidence of anomalous events. The journalist hired an independent video forensic expert to perform an enhancement on the raw footage. The expert adjusted the gamma levels and contrast to reveal details that were hidden in the deep blacks of the video. The enhanced footage revealed a second anomaly that neither Reed nor the police had noticed at the scene. Crouched low near a mile marker post on the left side of the road was a second smaller figure that appeared to be watching the man in the suit. The second figure was blurry and indistinct, but its presence added a new layer of complexity to the incident. If the first figure was a glitch, it is statistically impossible for a second coordinated glitch to appear in the same frame. Reed was deeply disturbed by the discovery of the second figure and felt a retrospective sense of dread about getting out of the truck. He realized that while he was searching the darkness with his flashlight, he might have been observed by whatever was crouching by the road. The psychological impact of the event began to affect his ability to work night shifts. He requested a transfer to a local daytime delivery route in the Pacific Northwest to avoid the isolation of the desert highways. He eventually resigned from the logistics company in 2025, citing persistent insomnia and anxiety related to driving. Reed moved to a small coastal town in Oregon, where he opened a hardware store and tried to leave his life on the road behind. The scientific community generally dismisses such accounts as pareidolia, where the brain interprets random patterns as familiar objects. However, a group of researchers from a university in Nevada decided to test the optical conditions of the sighting in 2024. They obtained permission to close that section of Route 50 for one night to conduct a recreation. They placed a mannequin dressed in a gray suit on the center line at the exact coordinates recorded by Reed's truck. They drove a similar vehicle toward the mannequin at various speeds while recording with the same model of dashboard camera. The resulting footage showed that in every single pass, the mannequin cast a distinct, long shadow on the asphalt. The researchers were unable to replicate the shadowless effect seen in Reed's video using physical objects. The report from the university researchers concluded that the video was anomalous, but could not determine its origin. They suggested that if the video was not a fabrication, then it captured a phenomenon that defies the current understanding of optics. The lack of a shadow implies that the figure was either not solid or was emitting its own light that canceled out the shadows. However, the radar data confirms that the object was solid enough to reflect radar waves. This paradox remains the central point of contention for anyone who studies the case. The trucking company eventually sealed the full accident file and refused to release any further data, citing privacy concerns for their former employee. Arthur Reed still possesses a digital copy of the original raw video file on an encrypted hard drive in his home. He has refused lucrative offers from television production companies to license the footage for paranormal documentary series. He told a close friend that he does not want to sensationalize what happened because he believes it was a warning rather than a spectacle. The friend later posted on a forum that Reed is convinced the figure in the suit turned its head at the last possible second. Reed claims that although the camera resolution was too low to capture it, he saw the man's eyes through the windshield. He described them not as human eyes, but as reflective surfaces like those of a nocturnal predator caught in a spotlight. This detail is what keeps him awake at night more than the figure itself. The stretch of Route 50 near Antelope Valley remains open to traffic, and thousands of vehicles pass through it every year without incident. The tire marks from Reed's emergency stop have long since faded from the asphalt worn away by weather and time. The mystery of the shadowless man in the gray suit has become a modern legend among the long-haul truckers who drive the corridor. Some drivers claim that their radios fill with static when they pass that specific mile marker, while others report sudden drops in temperature. Whether these are genuine phenomena or merely the power of suggestion is impossible to say. The only concrete evidence that remains is a digital video file that shows a man standing where no man should be and a radar log that says something was there. What the hikers heard inside the cave is unexplained. The dense woodlands of the Mark Twain National Forest in southern Missouri conceal hundreds of documented caves and sinkholes that stretch for miles beneath the limestone bedrock. Mark Halloway was a 32-year-old amateur geologist who had spent the last 5 years mapping the lesser-known cavern systems in the region for a local university project. He was accompanied on the morning of October 14, 2023, by Sarah Jenkins, a 29-year-old paramedic, and David Ross, a 35-year-old software engineer. The group planned to explore a narrow fissure known locally as the Devil's Throat, which had been sealed by a rock slide in 1998 and recently reopened by heavy rainfall. Their objective was to survey the structural stability of the entrance and document any biological specimens they encountered in the antechamber. Dispatch logs from the county sheriff's office confirmed that the group filed a detailed itinerary and expected to return to the surface by 1800 hours that same day. The three hikers parked their vehicle at a trailhead 5 miles from the nearest paved road and hiked for 2 hours through rough terrain to reach the cave entrance. They were equipped with industrial-grade headlamps and climbing gear, along with digital audio recorders to capture notes during the descent. State records indicate that the weather that day was clear and unseasonably warm, which meant the cave system would be relatively dry and stable. Mark led the descent into the vertical shaft, while Sarah and David managed the safety ropes from the anchor point on the surface. The initial drop was 60 feet into a large limestone chamber that branched off into 3 smaller tunnels that had not been mapped since the 70s. Audio files recovered later revealed that the group was in high spirits and commented frequently on the pristine condition of the rock formations. The group decided to follow the central tunnel, which sloped downward at a steep 40-degree angle and appeared to lead toward an underground aquifer. They moved slowly and checked the oxygen levels with a handheld meter every 50 feet to ensure the air remained breathable. David mentioned in one of the recordings that the temperature dropped significantly as they passed the 300-foot depth marker. He described a heavy silence that seemed to swallow the sound of their boots scraping against the damp stone floor. They had been underground for approximately 3 hours when Sarah suddenly signaled for the group to stop moving. She claimed she could hear a rhythmic thumping sound echoing from deep within the tunnel ahead of them. The sound was faint at first, but it gradually grew louder and more distinct as they held their breath to listen. Mark assumed the noise was caused by water dripping onto a hollow rock surface, or perhaps the shifting of limestone plates settling deeper in the earth. He pulled out his high-fidelity audio recorder and pointed the directional microphone down the dark corridor to capture the anomaly for analysis. The recording from that moment captures a low-frequency pulse that repeats exactly every 4 seconds without variation. David noted that the rhythm was too precise to be a natural geological occurrence and suggested it sounded mechanical. The group debated whether to turn back, but Mark insisted they investigate the source to rule out the possibility of trapped miners or illegal excavation equipment. They proceeded cautiously down the tunnel for another 200 yards until the passage opened up into a massive cathedral-sized cavern. The cavern was filled with towering stalagmites and a large pool of stagnant water that reflected the beams of their flashlights. The rhythmic thumping sound stopped abruptly the moment they stepped into the open space, leaving them in total silence once again. Sarah reported feeling a sudden drop in air pressure that made her ears pop painfully and caused a wave of dizziness. She checked the atmospheric monitor, but the device showed stable readings for oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. David scanned the perimeter of the room with his light and spotted a dark recess on the far wall that looked like a man-made mine shaft. He walked toward it to investigate while Mark stayed near the water to collect sediment samples. It was at this moment that the audio recorder picked up a voice whispering directly into the microphone. The whisper on the tape is unintelligible to casual listeners, but forensic audio experts later claimed it contained distinct phonetic structures. The voice did not belong to any of the 3 hikers, as they were all standing several feet apart and facing away from the device. Mark did not hear the whisper in real time and continued his work near the water's edge, unaware of the anomaly. David called out from the far side of the room and said that the mine shaft was actually just a trick of the shadows and the wall was solid rock. The group regrouped in the center of the cavern and decided to head back to the surface as the atmosphere in the cave had become oppressive. Sarah mentioned that she felt like they were being watched from the ceiling, but she could see nothing but limestone when she looked up. The ascent back to the surface was difficult because the group was fatigued and the humidity in the tunnel had risen sharply for no apparent reason. They reached the vertical shaft at 17:30 hours and began the climb up the ropes one by one. Mark was the last to climb, and he later told investigators that he heard the rhythmic thumping sound return just as he cleared the lip of the drop. He paused on the rope and looked down into the darkness, but saw only the fading beam of his backup light, which he had dropped. He scrambled out of the hole, and the group hiked back to their vehicle in silence. They did not discuss the sounds they heard until they were back in the safety of the town and sitting in a diner. Mark uploaded the audio files to his laptop that evening and was shocked to find that the file size for the cavern recording was 3 times larger than it should have been. He opened the file in a sound editing program and saw a visual waveform that showed a constant wall of noise that was not audible during playback. The only audible parts were their voices and the rhythmic thumping that David had pointed out. However, when Mark isolated the background frequencies, he found a layer of audio that sounded like heavy machinery operating in the distance. This was impossible because the nearest industrial site was over 40 miles away from the Devil's Throat cave system. He saved the isolated clip and sent it to a colleague at the university who specialized in acoustic geology. The colleague analyzed the clip and determined that the sound waves exhibited characteristics of a large ventilation fan or a turbine. He noted that the frequency was consistent with industrial air circulation systems used in deep underground bunkers. This analysis contradicted the official Geological Survey maps, which stated that the area was solid bedrock with no man-made structures. Mark tried to return to the cave 2 weeks later to verify the findings, but found the entrance blocked by a fresh rock slide. A park ranger stationed at the trailhead informed him that the area had been closed off indefinitely due to seismic instability. The ranger refused to elaborate on when the instability had been detected or who had authorized the closure. Some locals in the nearby town of Winona claimed that military trucks had been seen entering the forest access roads late at night during that same week. A retired miner told a local reporter that there were old lead mines in the area that connected to natural caverns, but they had been sealed by the government in the 70s. He suggested that the sounds the hikers heard were likely echoes from unauthorized drilling operations that were being hidden from the public. However, the Department of Natural Resources issued a statement denying any mining permits in that sector of the Mark Twain National Forest. The official explanation for the noise was shifting tectonic plates, causing acoustic resonance in the limestone chambers. David Ross later posted a detailed account of the expedition on a forum for spelunkers and included the audio clip of the rhythmic thumping. The thread generated hundreds of theories ranging from underground rivers to secret government facilities. One user, who claimed to be a former audio engineer, analyzed the whisper on the tape and suggested it was a reversed speech pattern. When the clip was played backward, the whisper seemed to say a phrase that sounded like "protocol initiated." David eventually deleted the post and his account without explanation 3 months after the incident. Friends of David stated that he had become paranoid about his digital privacy and believed his computer was being monitored. Sarah Jenkins never returned to caving after that trip and focused her energy on her career as a paramedic. She told her family that the feeling of pressure she experienced in the cavern had resulted in permanent tinnitus in her left ear. Medical records from November 2023 show that she was treated for a ruptured eardrum consistent with exposure to rapid barometric pressure changes. The doctor noted in the file that such an injury was unusual for a recreational caver who had not descended below 500 feet. Sarah maintained that the air pressure in the room had shifted instantly, as if a massive vacuum had been turned on. Her testimony aligns with the theory of a ventilation system, but conflicts with the lack of physical vents in the cave. Mark continued his geological work, but shifted his focus away from the Devil's Throat area and onto surface formations. He kept the original recordings on a hard drive in a safe deposit box and refused to release the full raw files to the public. He claimed in a private email to his professor that there were other sounds on the tape that he had not noticed initially. These sounds were described as high-pitched screeches that were outside the range of human hearing, but visible on the spectrogram. He feared that releasing the data would discredit his academic reputation or draw unwanted attention from the authorities. The hard drive remains in storage, and the full extent of what was captured that day is known only to him. The mystery of the Devil's Throat Cave is further complicated by a missing persons report filed in 1999 regarding 2 campers in the same area. The campers had reported hearing strange mechanical noises in the woods just days before they vanished without a trace. Their campsite was found abandoned with all their gear intact, including their wallets and car keys. Investigators at the time found no evidence of foul play and eventually classified the case as an accidental disappearance due to getting lost. The proximity of their campsite to the cave entrance suggests a potential link that was never fully investigated. The file on the missing campers was sealed in 2010 and remains inaccessible to the public. The rhythmic thumping heard by the hikers remains the most tangible piece of evidence that something exists beneath the forest floor. Skeptics argue that the human brain often interprets random natural patterns as orderly mechanical sounds when under stress. They cite the phenomenon of pareidolia, where the mind imposes structure on chaos to make sense of the unknown. However, the digital evidence of the waveform and the physical injury to Sarah's ear provide hard data that is difficult to dismiss. The cave entrance remains buried under tons of rock and soil, ensuring that no one else can verify the source of the sound. The forest above continues to grow silent and undisturbed, masking whatever lies waiting in the dark below. Trucker reveals why he avoids this desert highway. The relentless heat of the Mojave Desert transforms the asphalt of State Route 127 into a shimmering mirage that distorts distance and perception. This isolated two-lane highway stretches north from Baker, California, toward the Nevada border, and is frequently avoided by commercial drivers due to its lack of services. Frank Miller was a 55-year-old long-haul veteran who had spent 3 decades navigating the most desolate routes in the American Southwest. He was employed by a logistics firm based in Barstow that specialized in transporting hazardous materials to remote industrial sites near Death Valley. Miller was known among his peers as a rigid adherent to safety protocols and a man who kept his logbooks in perfect order. On the night of July 14, 2023, Miller was hauling a tanker of industrial solvent scheduled for delivery in Pahrump by sunrise. Dispatch logs from the trucking company confirmed that he departed the terminal at 2200 hours under clear skies and calm winds. The vehicle Miller operated was a customized Peterbilt 389 extended hood model that was equipped with a heavy-duty cooling system for desert operations. The truck featured a state-of-the-art telematics system that tracked the engine performance and the driver's location via satellite link every 30 seconds. Miller preferred to drive at night to avoid the blistering daytime temperatures, which could stress the engine and the tires on the hot pavement. He established a routine of checking his mirrors every 10 seconds and listening to audiobooks to maintain his alertness during the long solitary shifts. The first 2 hours of the drive were uneventful, as the truck hummed along the empty ribbon of road with the high beams cutting through the darkness. Miller noted in his voice log at midnight that the temperature outside was still hovering around 90 degrees Fahrenheit. The desolation of the landscape was absolute, with no other headlights visible in either direction for over 60 miles. The incident began as Miller approached a notorious section of the highway near the Dumont Dunes, where the shifting sands often encroached on the roadway. The time was exactly 01:30 in the morning when the truck's collision avoidance system suddenly engaged the air brakes without warning. The sudden deceleration threw Miller forward against his seatbelt as the tires locked up and skidded across the gritty asphalt. The truck came to a shuddering halt in the middle of the northbound lane, surrounded by the silence of the deep desert. Miller checked the dashboard display, which indicated that the front radar sensor had detected a stationary object directly in the truck's path. He looked through the windshield, expecting to see a stalled car or perhaps a wild burro standing on the centerline. However, the road ahead was completely empty and illuminated brightly by the truck's LED light bars. Miller sat in the idling cab for several moments to allow his heart rate to settle before deciding to investigate the sensor error. He grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and a tire iron from beneath his seat as a precaution before opening the driver's side door. The heat of the desert night hit him instantly as he stepped down onto the running board and scanned the perimeter. He walked to the front of the truck and inspected the grille and the bumper for any sign of an impact with an animal. There was no damage to the chrome and no blood or fur that would indicate a collision had occurred. Miller then walked 50 yards down the road to the spot where the radar claimed the obstacle had been located. The asphalt was pristine and unbroken except for the long black skid marks left by his own tires. The driver was about to return to the cab when he noticed something unusual on the sandy shoulder of the road near a mile marker post. He shone his flashlight beam onto the ground and saw a single set of boot prints leading from the desert scrub onto the pavement. The prints were fresh and the edges of the sand were still sharp, which suggested they had been made within the last few minutes. Miller followed the tracks with his light and saw that they stopped abruptly in the middle of the right lane. There were no return tracks leading back off the road and no sign of scuffle or disturbance in the dust. It appeared as if the person who made the tracks had simply vanished into thin air upon reaching the center of the lane. Miller felt a sudden chill despite the heat and hurried back to the safety of his locked cab. He climbed back into the driver's seat and locked the doors before radioing his dispatch center to report the emergency stop and the strange tracks. The dispatcher on duty logged the call at 0145 and noted that Miller sounded breathless and agitated. Miller stated that he felt he was being watched from the darkness beyond the reach of his headlights. He decided to pull the video file from his dashboard camera to see what had triggered the sensor before he continued driving. The camera system was designed to automatically save the 20 seconds preceding any hard braking event. Miller navigated the menu on the small screen and pressed play on the clip timestamped at 0130. The video showed the empty road stretching out before the truck as the speedometer climbed to 65 miles per hour. The footage played normally until 3 seconds before the brakes engaged, when a glitch caused the screen to pixelate briefly. When the image stabilized, a figure was visible standing motionless in the center of the lane facing the oncoming truck. The figure appeared to be a tall male wearing tattered clothing that hung loosely from a gaunt frame. The most disturbing detail was that the figure did not have a face, but rather a smooth surface where features should have been. Miller watched in horror as the truck in the video rushed toward the figure without slowing down until the automatic brakes kicked in. In the final frame before the truck stopped, the figure seemed to dissipate like smoke or dust into the grill. Miller replayed the video 5 times, and each time the figure was clearly visible in the high-definition recording. Terrified by what he had seen, Miller put the truck in gear and accelerated away from the scene as quickly as the heavy load would allow. He drove the remaining distance to Pahrump without stopping and kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He arrived at the delivery site at 4 in the morning and refused to exit the cab until the facility security guard approached. Miller handed over the manifest through a cracked window and told the guard he was not feeling well. He unloaded the tanker swiftly and drove immediately to a truck stop with bright lights and other people. He submitted the dashcam footage to his safety manager later that morning along with his resignation letter. Miller stated that he would never drive that stretch of Route 127 again, regardless of the pay or the urgency. The logistics company launched a full investigation into the incident to determine if the braking event was a mechanical failure or driver error. The safety team analyzed the raw video file and the telemetry data from the truck's black box. They confirmed that the radar system had indeed detected a solid mass in front of the vehicle at the specific time. However, the video experts claimed that the figure on the screen was likely a compression artifact caused by heat waves. They argued that the high temperature of the asphalt caused the air to shimmer, which the low-light sensor interpreted as a shape. This explanation failed to account for the radar data, which relies on radio waves rather than optics. The conflict between the visual evidence and the sensor data created a deadlock in the final report. State records from the California Highway Patrol show that a patrol unit was dispatched to the location of the skid marks the following day. The officer who responded to the call found the skid marks exactly where Miller had described them. The officer also found the boot prints on the shoulder leading onto the roadway, just as Miller had reported. The prints were photographed and measured, but they did not match any known footwear database used by law enforcement. The tracks ended in the middle of the lane, with no logical explanation for where the person had gone. The officer noted in the report that there were no vehicle tracks nearby that could have picked up a pedestrian. The desert floor on either side of the road was undisturbed for miles. Some locals in the nearby town of Baker have shared stories about a phantom hitchhiker who haunts that specific stretch of highway. Archives from a local newspaper in 1998 mention a drifter who died of dehydration in that area after his car broke down. The description of the drifter's clothing in the police report from that time matches the tattered rags seen in Miller's video. However, investigators never found a link between the old case and the modern sighting recorded by the truck. The lack of facial features on the figure remains a detail that does not fit with the ghost story narrative. This anomaly suggests that the phenomenon might be something more abstract or unrelated to the previous death. The dashboard camera footage was eventually archived by the company and labeled as an equipment malfunction due to environmental conditions. Miller refused to accept this conclusion and shared his story on a private forum for professional drivers. Several other truckers commented on the post, claiming they had experienced similar sensor failures in that same valley. One driver mentioned that his radio would always cut out at that mile marker and emit a high-pitched static squeal. Another driver claimed to have seen a figure running alongside his truck at 60 miles per hour. These anecdotal accounts suggest a pattern of unexplained activity that the corporate logs failed to capture. Frank Miller retired from the trucking industry entirely in 2024 and moved to a small town in Oregon to work in a lumberyard. He still suffers from nightmares about the faceless figure and refuses to drive on unlit roads at night. He kept a copy of the video file on a USB drive, which he keeps locked in a safe in his home. He told his brother that the scariest part of the video was not the figure itself, but the timestamp. The timestamp on the video jumped forward by 2 minutes during the glitch, which implies a loss of time. Miller has no memory of those missing 2 minutes and cannot account for what happened during that gap. The telemetry logs show the truck was idling, but the GPS data shows a momentary loss of signal. The truck involved in the incident was put back into service with a new driver and continued to run the same route for 6 months. The new driver reported no visual sightings but complained frequently about the radar system malfunctioning. The maintenance team eventually replaced the entire front sensor array, citing faulty wiring and heat damage. The truck was later sold to a different company and moved to a route in the Midwest. The mystery of what stood on the highway that night remains unsolved and buried in the company's digital archives. The skid marks on the asphalt have since faded, but the coordinates remain a blind spot for many drivers. Researchers from a university in Nevada later requested access to the telemetry data as part of a study on electromagnetic anomalies in the desert. The logistics company denied the request, citing proprietary information and driver privacy concerns. The researchers believe that the area may be subject to localized magnetic field distortions that affect electronic equipment. This theory would explain the radar failure and the GPS signal loss, but it does not explain the boot prints. The physical evidence of the tracks suggests a tangible presence that walked on the sand. The combination of technological failure and physical traces creates a paradox that science has yet to resolve. The stretch of State Route 127 continues to be a vital artery for transport trucks moving goods between California and Nevada. Most drivers pass through the area without incident and only see the endless expanse of scrub brush and sand. However, there is a small community of veterans who will radio ahead to check if the road is clear before entering the valley. They speak in codes and use slang to warn each other about the shadow in the lane. Frank Miller's story has become a cautionary tale among them, a reminder that technology cannot see everything. The desert keeps its secrets well, and the heat waves continue to dance on the horizon. Night Guard refused to watch the security monitor. The expansive retail complex known as Rolling Acres Mall in Akron, Ohio, was once a thriving hub of commerce, but by 2022, it had become a desolate structure of crumbling concrete and shattered glass. Elias Thorne was a 44-year-old private security contractor who had been assigned to the property to monitor the site for arsonists and urban explorers. Thorne was a former logistics manager who had lost his job during the economic downturn and took the night watch position because it offered solitude and steady pay. He was known among his colleagues as a rational and meticulous man who relied heavily on procedure and documentation. Thorne arrived for his shift on the evening of November 4th, 2022, prepared for another uneventful 12 hours of sitting in the command center. Dispatch logs from that night indicate that he checked in with the central office at 1800 hours and reported that all perimeter gates were locked and secure. The security office was located on the ground floor near the former food court, and it served as the nerve center for the few remaining active systems in the building. Thorne sat in a worn ergonomic chair, facing a wall of 12 high-definition LCD monitors that provided views of the main concourses and loading docks. The room was kept at a chilly 60 degrees to protect the server racks that hummed loudly in the corner. Thorne spent the first few hours of his shift reviewing the playback from the previous day and filling out digital activity reports on a tablet. He had developed a habit of scanning the monitors in a specific clockwise pattern to ensure he never missed a frame of activity. However, there was one screen in the bottom right corner labeled Camera 4 that he had subconsciously started to avoid during his sweeps. This feed displayed the entrance to the defunct department store wing, which had been sealed off from the main mall by a heavy metal shutter. State records regarding the property show that the department store wing had been slated for demolition 3 years prior, but the funding had fallen through at the last minute. The area was completely devoid of electricity, and the only light source came from the infrared sensors on the security camera itself. Thorne later stated in an interview with local law enforcement that Camera 4 often displayed visual artifacts that looked like shadows moving across the lens. He attributed these glitches to the aging wiring and the damp conditions inside the unheated structure. Maintenance logs from October 2022 reveal that Thorne had requested a repair for Camera 4 multiple times, citing intermittent signal loss. The request was marked as pending by the facility's management team due to a lack of available parts. Thorne was forced to work with the faulty equipment and often adjusted the contrast settings to minimize the visual noise. The incident began at approximately 2:15 in the morning when the silence of the security office was broken by a sharp beep from the motion detection system. Thorne looked up from his reading material and saw that the alert was coming from the monitor connected to Camera 4. He leaned closer to the screen and squinted against the grainy black and white image to identify the source of the trigger. The hallway on the screen appeared empty at first glance, with nothing but dust motes floating in the infrared beam. Thorne checked the other monitors to see if anyone had breached the external doors, but all other feeds showed quiet corridors. He assumed it was another malfunction and reached for the mouse to reset the alarm sensor. Reportedly, his hand froze mid-air when he noticed a dark shape standing perfectly still near the bottom edge of the frame. The figure on the screen was difficult to distinguish from the surrounding shadows because of the poor image quality and the distance of the camera. Thorne described the intruder as a person of average build wearing heavy winter clothing that absorbed the infrared light. The person was standing with their back to the camera and facing the metal shutter that blocked the entrance to the main mall area. Thorne felt a surge of adrenaline and immediately grabbed his two-way radio to contact the off-site dispatch supervisor. He spoke in a hushed tone and reported a Code 6, which was the internal designation for a trespassing in progress. The supervisor instructed Thorne to remain in the locked security office and to continue monitoring the situation while they contacted the Akron Police Department. Thorne acknowledged the order and kept his eyes fixed on the figure on Camera 4. Minutes ticked by agonizingly slowly as Thorne watched the intruder on the screen without blinking. He expected the person to produce a spray paint can or a crowbar, which were the standard tools of the vandals he usually encountered. Instead, the figure simply stood there with an unnatural stillness that Thorne found deeply unsettling. There was no shifting of weight and no movement of the head or arms to suggest the person was looking around. Archived notes from the security company investigation suggest that Thorne began to doubt his own perception after 10 minutes of inactivity. He adjusted the brightness on the monitor in an attempt to get a clearer view of the intruder's clothing or features. The adjustment caused the screen to flicker briefly, but when the image stabilized, the figure was still there in the exact same position. The atmosphere in the security office became oppressive as Thorne waited for the sound of police sirens to cut through the night. He glanced at the timestamp on the monitor and realized that 20 minutes had passed since he first spotted the intruder. Suddenly, the figure on the screen began to move, but it was not a natural human motion. Thorne told investigators that the figure rotated slowly on the spot without taking any steps, as if it were on a turntable. The movement was smooth and mechanical, and it resulted in the intruder facing directly toward the camera lens. The camera was mounted 12 feet high on a concrete pillar, so the figure had to tilt its head back at a severe angle to look into the lens. Thorne recoiled in his chair and pushed himself away from the desk as he stared at the face on the monitor. The facial features of the intruder were completely obscured by a patch of digital distortion that looked like a block of static. Thorne stated that the rest of the image was relatively clear, but the face was a swirling mass of gray pixels. He felt a sudden wave of nausea and a distinct feeling that he was being watched by something malevolent. The dispatch logs show that Thorne keyed his radio microphone again at 2:38 in the morning, but said nothing. The recording captures only the sound of his rapid breathing and the hum of the servers in the background. He later admitted that he was too terrified to speak because he felt that the figure on the screen could somehow hear him. He made the decision to look away from the monitor and focused his gaze on the door of the security office to ensure it was locked. Police units arrived at the perimeter of the mall at 2:45 in the morning and announced their presence over the public address system. Thorne heard the officers banging on the loading dock doors and finally found the courage to stand up and let them in. He led the two officers through the maze of service corridors toward the department store wing while explaining what he had seen. The group arrived at the sealed entrance and found the metal shutter intact and locked from the inside. The officers used a master key to open a service door and entered the wing with their tactical flashlights drawn. Thorne stayed back near the entrance while the police swept the area for any sign of the intruder. The beam of the flashlights cut through the stale air and revealed a thick layer of undisturbed dust covering the floor. The officers cleared the hallway and the adjacent rooms within 15 minutes and returned to where Thorne was waiting. They informed him that the area was completely empty and there were no footprints in the dust other than their own. Thorne insisted that he had watched a man standing there for over 20 minutes and demanded they check the roof access points. The officers complied but found all roof hatches welded shut and secured with heavy rusted padlocks. County files from 2023 indicate that the responding officers filed the incident as a false alarm caused by equipment error. They noted in their report that Thorne appeared visibly shaken and was sweating profusely despite the cold temperature in the building. Thorne refused to accept their conclusion and led them back to the security office to show them the footage. Thorne sat down at the control desk and rewound the video feed for camera 4 to the time of the incident. He pressed play and waited for the figure to appear on the screen so he could vindicate himself. However, the playback showed nothing but an empty hallway for the entire duration of the time frame. The motion sensor log on the computer showed a trigger event at 2:15, but the video file associated with it was corrupted. The officers watched the static-filled screen for a few moments before telling Thorne to get some rest. They left the site at 3:30 in the morning, leaving Thorne alone in the office with the monitors. He spent the remainder of his shift sitting with his back to the wall, refusing to look at the bank of screens. The following morning, a senior technician from the security company arrived to perform a diagnostic on the system. Thorne watched as the technician traced the wiring for camera 4 from the server room out to the department store wing. The technician returned 30 minutes later with a puzzled expression and a bundle of loose wires in his hand. He explained to Thorne that the camera in the department store wing had been physically disconnected from the network. The wires had been severed cleanly, and the copper ends were oxidized, which suggested they had been cut weeks ago. This revelation meant that it was impossible for Thorne to have received a live feed from that camera during his shift. The monitor should have been displaying a blue signal loss screen instead of a view of the hallway. Thorne resigned from his position immediately after the technician delivered the news and refused to work out his notice period. He moved out of his apartment in Akron the following week and relocated to a rural town in West Virginia to live with his brother. He has refused all requests for interviews from journalists and urban exploration bloggers who have tried to contact him. The only person he confided in was his brother, who later shared the details of the story on a private internet forum for security professionals. The brother claimed that Thorne is still plagued by nightmares of the static-faced figure and refuses to be in rooms with televisions or computer monitors. Thorne remains convinced that what he saw was not a technical glitch, but something that was projecting itself onto the screen. Some locals claimed that the Rolling Acres Mall had been a site of tragic events long before it was abandoned. Archives from local newspapers mention a construction accident in the early 80s where a worker fell from the upper level of the department store wing. Rumors circulated for years among mall employees that the wing was haunted by the spirit of the deceased worker. However, investigators never confirmed any link between the accident and the security anomalies reported by Thorne. The skepticism surrounding the story is fueled by the lack of hard evidence and the convenient corruption of the video files. Yet the maintenance log discovered by a scavenger months later adds a complicating factor to the narrative. A group of urban explorers entered the mall in January 2023 and found a maintenance clipboard left behind in the security office. The The log contained an entry signed by a different guard dated 2 days before Thorne's incident. The entry noted that camera 4 had been acting up and displaying images of people who were not there. This detail contradicts the official company stance that the camera was simply broken and disconnected. It suggests that other employees had witnessed similar phenomena but had chosen not to report it officially. The explorers took photos of the logbook and uploaded them to a data sharing site before they were removed for copyright violations. The existence of this log implies a pattern of events that the security firm may have been trying to suppress. The security firm dissolved its contract with the property owners shortly after Thorne's resignation, citing hazardous working conditions. The mall remained abandoned until the city eventually moved forward with demolition plans to clear the site for an industrial park. The department store wing was the first section to be torn down by the wrecking crews in late 2023. During the demolition, workers reportedly found a small hidden room behind a false wall near the location where the figure had stood. Inside the room, they found a sleeping bag and a collection of batteries, but no identification. This discovery led some to believe that a squatter had been living in the walls and tapping into the camera system. However, this theory does not explain how the squatter could manipulate the video feed to show a figure when the camera was disconnected. The mystery of what Elias Thorne saw on the monitor remains one of the most debated topics in the online security community. Skeptics argue that isolation and sleep deprivation caused a detailed hallucination that Thorne's mind projected onto the screen. They point to the fact that the human brain seeks patterns in visual noise and can create faces out of static. Believers argue that the severed wires and the corroborating maintenance log point to something more unexplainable. They suggest that the entity in the mall did not need wires to transmit its image to the observer. The only certainty is that a rational man walked into a shift at Rolling Acres Mall and left with his life completely derailed by a feed from a broken camera.